So welcome to PoetryEast, a special PoetryEast in partnership with Carcanet Press. You can see people gathering here at the London Buddhist Centre. We're gathering for Sasha Dugdale, who's launching her 6th collection of poems called The Strongbox, the most ambitious poem she's written, a book-length poem in 14 chapters, a remarkable poem. And I'm going to be here at the London Buddhist Centre in PoetryEast asking about her life, looking back at some of the work from other collections, but really focusing this evening on this new collection, The Strongbox, a very strong, even disturbing poem, a kind of elegy for a divided world. So you're going to really enjoy this. I hope you enjoy it. That's great. That's good.
I can touch the ground on this chair.
Oh, can you? Yeah, that's good. Couldn't you last time? Oh, no, that one. No. So welcome back, Sasha. Really nice to have you here again. Sasha and I have become friends, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
But what we thought we'd do is, before we actually go into the Strongbox itself, open the Strongbox, as it were, I thought it'd be good to have a little bit of a retrospect. As I said, this is your 6th collection, and I think, well, as I say, I think it is your most ambitious poem today, the most ambitious book. And I thought we'd look at some of its precedents, but also get a chance to get to know you a bit more. So we're going to start with your poem from, I don't know, The Red House. Anyway, why don't you just jump into that poem? So you might want to say something about it, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I promised I'd read this poem for somebody who's in this community, Padmavajra, who can't be here tonight. But both Padmavajra and I come from the same village in Sussex, and this poem is about that village or town. And it's also from 2011, I realised.
Right,
going back, also pre-Steam Age. But it's, and it also slightly picks up on something you were talking about earlier about rivers, because it's very much concerned with the geology of that area, which is it's a chalk area, and it has winter-born chalk streams which disappear in the summer and are very full in the winter. So that's a sort of detail that lies behind the poem. But I'll just read the poem. And it's interesting, Padmavajra contacted me out of the blue because he'd seen this poem printed, and he recognised the name Princes, which is the name of a haberdashers in Hassocks. And he wanted to know whether I actually came from Hassocks. So that's how we connected. So I'm going to stand up to read, because I'm not very good at sitting down reading.
Is that all right for the camera? Let's just double check. I don't want you to be out of shot. Yeah,
is that
fine.
okay? Yeah,
great.
I'm not that tall. So
No, that's right. You should be fine.
So this is Princes. Yesterday afternoon, one of the shortest of the year, when the hills were dark with a night not yet come, and the high street silent, and all the doors closed, I learnt that Princes would soon be gone. A haberdasher's is hardly a terrible loss. It was not a place I ever went in much, although I admired the near redundant, near extinct art of dressing the provincial shopfront, the quaint pre-war touches, how the ladies' shirts were tied in pretty ribbons at their waists, and jaunty trilbies floated over dancing jackets, bearing pockets of silken hanky points. And often I have seen gentlemen cradling paper bags of slippers and shoes with new black heels, slipping out from under the shop's sunblind and disappearing down the modern street. 30 years now. I walked to school that way, saw the seasons come and go in their displays, nightshirts hanging from green hoops in spring, snowmen holding Christmas stockings in branched fingers. You would call it an ordinary shop in an ordinary street, and not somewhere the dream's particles might lie. The lady serving me lost her husband last year. She's glad it's over, she says. She needs more time. I have not the wit to offer any comfort. The window unadorned reads closing, end of line. How the fact of it can suddenly strike you. Yes, time is good, I say. I'm sure things heal with time. But time flows down the high street like a river, like the Spittal, which exceeds its muddy confines each winter, and the rest of the long year whispers insistent at the back of the shopper's mind. I should be able to escape this honest town. There must be places where creation sings aloud. Can you not hear it? How its blasting trumpet wind blows the streams back up to higher ground. This next spring we will wade up the Spittal River and shrug the town from us and leave it lie. How the stream narrows now and lightens, its pulse grows feeble, its breath a tiny sigh. In the window I see the yards of draper's tape, which once knew the height of a body, its mortal breadth. So night falls once again with the roaring of a river, indifferent to its very depths.
Okay. Thank you, Sasha.
I hate to spoil the tone, but it became a Costa coffee.
Wouldn't have worked. But you never did leave Hassocks, did you? So tell me a bit about Hassocks, and like in the poem, that there's an imagination possibly of leaving, but I don't think you ever did.
I've never managed to escape. It's a small villagey town in the South Downs, and it's not even particularly attractive. I think the best thing you can say about it is it's easy to get out of.
And why do you think you didn't leave? But you just didn't.
Purely practical reasons. I had children and ended up there.
Yeah. So listen, let's move on quite quickly. Let's go on to this second poem, Valentine, which is from your fourth collection, Joy. Joy was a PBS Choice Poetry Book Society choice, and the title poem, Joy, which is a monologue really by Blake's wife, Catherine. That's right, isn't it? Won the Forward Prize for Best Single Poem, a wonderful poem. I was saying I'd like to have had time to read that, but we'd be here very late if we were going to do that as well. But this is one poem from that, so let's hear that and talk a bit about that as well. Okay,
so this is actually a sonnet, and I don't think there's much I can say about this except that, but no, I'll speak about it.
Okay.
It's Valentine's. I don't quite say it anymore. Now the kids are teens, and there are sudden wars, threads of conversations that no longer want to pass through the needle's eye of how we recast ourselves in new politics, new sadnesses, newspapers. Irritability, like the substance left by vapours that have long departed the alembic's lung, and taste with a quetch's bitter tongue. The hours and days mass themselves around and harden like the filthy, frozen ground on railway embankments on a mid-February day. And that is, in truth, what I never quite say. Those trashed slopes are home to the foxglove, an ancient restorer of the heart's beat, my love.
Well, the first thing to say about it, well, actually, what I thought I'd say about it is have a look at Fred Skinner's. Is it Fred? No, Frank Skinner's poetry podcast. Has anybody listened to that? It's actually really good. But he does a whole one of his poetry podcasts on this poem and reads it in a particular way, which may not be the way everyone would read it, but it's a good reading, isn't it? It's proper reading. But I wanted to give a little shout out for Frank Skinner's poetry podcast. It's a very good way of introducing poetry, particularly sort of to people who are a bit new to poetry, I thought.
I didn't listen to it. I just couldn't. But I was very, very grateful to him for talking about Valentine's. But he did make it sound like it was a terribly collapsing relationship.
It sounded like a divorce poem, didn't it? Which is a shame because your husband's here. But hey, you know, he's smiling, so... But one of the things I wanted to draw out of it, I mean, it is a lovely poem, I think, a really lovely poem. It's the use of rhyme, so it's all in rhyming couplets. And one of the things we'll be looking at when we get to the strongbox, and we will get there in a bit, is the thing that strikes me about you as a poet is you're very much a modernist poet, and we'll talk about that later. And there's something interesting and exciting for me about your willingness to go you've got a modernist aesthetic, I think, running all the way through the work, and yet you still come back to rhyme, and in the strongbox you come back to rhyme again and again, and then break it up, and then it reappears, and then you use form in a modernist way. Anyway, I thought it'd be good to hear a bit about how did we get rhyme in a modernist poem.
Well, I've always used lots of rhyme, and I really like it as a principle. I remember a Russian translator, Grigory Khrushchev, said to me that he thought it was magic because when you used rhyme, a thought might come to you as a result of the rhyme that you would never have had by yourself. And I thought that was a really wonderful and very perceptive thing to say. I'm not sure whether it's magic or not, but there is something about rhyme which is fantastically creative and engenders new thoughts, new directions. And I have to use it a lot because I translate a lot of Russian poetry, and Russian poetry even now uses a great deal more rhyme than I think on the whole we use in English language traditions. Although whenever I say that, I have to remember I did a seminar about translating British poetry into Russian, and discovered that far more of it was rhymed or half rhymed or part rhymed than perhaps we might think. So I think the rhyme tradition isn't gone and is still thriving in its own particular way in British poetry as well. So it's and form is generally very important to me, but form is part of meaning. It's always part of meaning. So I don't think you can take those two apart. So the fact that I use rhyme, that I've come from I suppose what you might think of as a more lyric tradition, is part of my thinking. Yeah,
I thought I'd be interested to touch on that. This coming from a lyric tradition, and then how that has changed, because that has one of the things that you see changing, going looking backwards through the collections. We nearly got you to read another sonnet, a beautiful lyric sonnet from an earlier collection. How did that lyric tradition start to sort of change for you?
Well, I think that the lyric is to some extent in trouble. It's impossible to. I think it's very difficult to write lyric, which is a sort of very harmonious and song-like in many ways form, when there are so many dissonances in the world around you. The lyric starts to seem, in that case, slightly euphemistic almost, or not. It doesn't really represent what you see around you, and so I suppose then it starts to falter in you, and you can't. You need to find ways to make sort of patches, I suppose, ways of fixing, and the lyric simply can't cope with that. So I think that's why it has over the period I've been writing become something that's more modernist, more fractured, more broken.
I suppose the lyric does imply a kind of harmony, doesn't it? As you say, a song-like unity, which perhaps suggests a world in which a unity is possible.
And I think there's also a sort of suspicion of it, because it bypasses thought and reason and so on, and it produces it can produce a slightly trance-like feeling, and and increasingly you feel suspicious of any form of writing that produces that. We need all our wits about us.
Yeah, we do. I was going to say more, but let's move on. I wanted to look at this poem from your 5th collection, Deformations, A Female Peacock. Really, it's the first poem, untitled poem, in your welfare handbook, which is a sequence of poems. But let's get you to read it first and then talk about that.
I was saying to Maitreyabandhu earlier that I have hardly read from this collection because it came out during COVID, and so there weren't many reading opportunities. And I was quite glad of that in a way, because it was quite troubling material. It's about Eric Gill, and as many of you all know, he's an artist who is also perhaps notorious for the fact that he sexually abused his children. So it's a difficult and tricky sequence, and I think probably COVID came along in the nick of time and saved me from having to read it out loud.
But you were saying that also that, you know, he comes from a world near your world, you know,
That's right,
your
yeah.
Catholic world.
That's right. So the reason I started writing about him is he founded his guild. He was originally from Brighton, and he founded his guild in Ditchling, on Ditchling Common, which is very, very close to me. And this is in the early part of the 20th century, and he was there for a while, and the guild remained until I was a child in Ditchling, and it was a Catholic guild, so they had a chapel of their own, which they built. They built this, actually important for this poem, they built an enormous, great big phallic cross, which was on the railway embankment just outside Burgess Hill, and you could see it on the steam train if you took that line down to Lewes. But it then, as the guild got more and more sort of modest, I think that the practicing Catholics, they all moved to the new Hassocks Catholic Church, which is where I used to go as a child, because in my childhood I was a practicing Catholic. So some of the altar boys and so on were sort of descendants of the original guild members. So there is a very close connection with guild. So this is the opening poem, and actually what I should say is that it opens with a female peacock, and this is because Eric Gill wrote a lot of, he wasn't just an artist, he wrote a lot of prose about art, and he had lots of views on art and aesthetics, and he had lots of views on women and how they should dress and so on, and he thought that women should dress in a very drab way and men should be the peacocks. So this, I think, is probably, I took a lot of notes from his essays, and I think this line comes from something that he wrote. A female peacock would be a monstrosity. What shape would it assume? How hard it is to envisage a building that goes up and up. When I write about this, shall I bang my fist on the pound of paper to puncture it? Or shall I gradually entrap my subject with words written in mucus and the outgoings, in discharge, in dirty things like cleaning cloths, retreating onto the sands of flirtation, where masculinity is exhausted, prickled by marram and saltbush, dragging the long shaft of his cross.
I think that last line, dragging the long shaft of his cross, is so strong, so strong. Well, we were just talking earlier, and Sasha was asking me, why did I particularly want you to read that, and I was just saying, I just think it's a poem. You know, sometimes that's about all you can say about a good poem, is you think, that's a poem, you know, and then if someone says to you, what do you mean? It's a poem. It's like saying, that is beautiful. If someone says, what do you mean by it being beautiful? You just say, well, the word beautiful is a word to indicate that you can't say anything more. You know, anyway, I thought that was a poem. I should have just mentioned, of course, that is it deformations or deformations?
I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
That's another side effect of never having read from it.
Yes, that's right. We've never got this sorted. That was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. So there is readings of you online doing that, some of the poems in them. But as you say, history took over. But let's now finally turn to this new and, as I say, most ambitious collection, the sixth collection, the Strong Box. Very striking cover for this. As I said, I think it is your most ambitious poem yet, both in terms of its length. It's a book-length poem in 14 chapters. In its form, it varies from lyric rhyming. It's some parts of it like classic lyric, a very, very beautiful lyric, and it moves from that to a bullet point list, to a monologue, to a play, to broken and sort of strong, as we were saying earlier, I was saying earlier, sort of strong sense of erasures in it, a narrative voice that's been half erased almost throughout the poem. I mean, I thought we'd start, before you read it, I had this idea that it's like a modern wasteland. Like Eliot, it's an ambitious, long poem. It uses different styles, like Eliot does in The Wasteland. It's told in different voices, like Eliot does in The Wasteland. It's fragmentary. It uses lyric elements and modernist elements, like Eliot's Wasteland. The Wasteland is about the wasteland, and I feel that The Strongbox is a kind of elegy for our deeply divided world, even an elegy for civilization, it seems to me. So I was wondering what you think of my idea that it's a modern wasteland.
The wasteland did play a part in it, because I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that period particularly because in many ways, when I was writing Strongbox, I was in a situation where I was thinking about war daily, and I suspect that The Wasteland and all those works of the sort of early 1920s, were also conceived with that in mind, that sense of war being a possibility, more than a possibility, an actual historical and recent fact, scarring the people they knew, the people around them. And so there is a sort of, perhaps it's not so much, it's just, certain conditions bring forth certain types of works that they condition how you think about the world. You can't think about it in a whole way because it's been blown apart.
And you've had quite a lot to do with translation in that way. Can you say a bit more about because you've been sort of very aware of the war.
Yeah. So I wrote The Strongbox in 2022, and I started it just before, right at the very beginning of the year, and very quickly the full scale of invasion of Ukraine started in February, and I think that it was to begin with really very hard, because I was with a lot of friends, talking to them all the time, who were either leaving Russia or leaving Ukraine or staying but weren't sure how to negotiate that. And of course the news is constant, the news from the front line, the news from Russia, the news of repression. And I was translating a lot of those things. They seemed really important to translate, so I was translating a lot of accounts of war in Ukraine or anti-war sentiment in Russia and trying to help people. So I was quite immersed in it, and it was a very, very difficult year. It was very, very emotionally exhausting, and much worse for the people who were actually fleeing. But you can't help, if you're translating, but take on some of that, because you're trying to express how they feel. You're trying to process it through yourself, really. Yeah. So it became quite a difficult year, and I wrote The Strongbox during that year as a way of trying to cope with what was going on, and trying to I suppose find some way of representing it. And when I finished it, one of the things that made me feel like I'd finished it was when I wrote the last words, I felt an enormous sense of relief. And I don't know if it was cathartic, but I certainly felt like I had managed to produce something in the face of it all that summed up how I was feeling. So yeah, it's very intimately linked with war and experiences of war.
Yeah. So let's hear that section. It's not quite the first, not quite the beginning of the poem. I can't remember which part it was. Yes, it's on page 3, but it's quite early on. The first chapter is the longest chapter in the whole book. But let's hear it, and let's talk a bit more about it.
I haven't read this out aloud yet. I mean, I've practiced to my
to your
bathroom mirror. Yeah. But I haven't actually read it out aloud. But there's something we were talking about this, that, you know, the book doesn't, one part of the book doesn't come into being until you read it aloud. So it feels like tonight it's kind of coming into being in that way with all of you, which is really a really lovely feeling, actually, really. It began on the least good road. Late at night, a silent soldier sent to bring her here, his leather pouch on the passenger seat, his bow slung over his shoulder. The road signs deteriorate ever smaller, bent and battered, busted, bullet-holed. The roads incline. They stopped at roadside inns twice. And twice she waited in the cold and silence, the music abated, the mountain stars above. She's told not to open the door, so she huddles, draws her furred hood tighter, the chill of leatherette under her thighs, smell of petrol from jerry cans. She need only light a match and the whole lot, just the blackened skeleton of the pickup, men scattering from the inn door. Not too late to run. But where to? Hadn't the fates conspired to weave her bridal shroud, watching her with their one eye hanging from the rear view? Too late. Too late. Too much has passed. Love came and ripped out her heart, replaced it with a burning coal, folding air tickets into a travel pouch, and promises of gifts, swatches of wedding silk, a garnet brooch to bleed out in her sponge bag. And here she is, dabbing wax on her lips, on the cold, slippery back seat in a high-altitude lay-by. All requites fire, and fire requites all. So coins are needed to purchase fine cloth, and cloth given in return for gold. But a woman entwisted in fine cloth may herself be purchased or stolen.
That's great. So we start with this abduction of a girl. I wonder whether you, I mean, it's dark stuff, isn't it? Right from the onset, and I don't know, it's quite difficult to always talk about. But perhaps say what you can about that, and then also this, as we were talking earlier about, there are passages that appear in sort of in italics, these sort of lyric. You heard that at the end. There's a change of register into this lyric mode. Perhaps talk a little bit about both this sort of unnamed war zone, this unnamed girl, this abduction. I mean, the thing that it reminded me of, I will let you speak in a minute. The thing, it coincided with me going, whilst I was reading it, I think for the second time, it coincided with me going to see the Auerbach charcoal drawings in, where are they? What? Yeah, the Courtauld, yeah, that's right. And if you haven't seen them, do go and see them. And that there's something about those drawings that your poem reminds me of those drawings remind me of the poem. The portraits in Auerbach's drawings, those early drawings, are freighted with history. You feel the weight of history, but you don't know what it is. It's not spelled out what the history is, but something, you feel it, don't you, very strongly. And it has these lit patches and ripped patches and fragmented, almost collaged and overworked and erased. I thought there was something of the atmosphere of the poem that very much chimed with that. The sense of ordinary everyday people weighted by history and freighted and pushed and bullied by history, and in this case horrific history, and of this sort of glimmering dark lightness, darkness followed by just tiny bits of light, which felt like a sort of spirit through the poem, but I don't know whether that chimes with your sense of it, Sasha.
Yeah, well, the opening part, I really liked that Auerbach exhibition. It was extraordinary, and it remained in my mind for ages. That attentiveness and that spiritual exercise of rubbing everything out and starting again, and rubbing everything out and starting. Like, the lightness wasn't superficial at all. It could only be achieved by some sort of spiritual exercise. That was extraordinary. And I suppose that the opening part to the Strongbox was, to some extent, concerned with the abduction of women and in war as kind of collateral, and there's at least a little of the case of some of the girls who were groomed to become ISIS brides, and but the general drawing of women into war and their like servitude, I suppose, that concerned me. And I was thinking about, as a sort of archetype of that, Helen of Troy. So I began to think of the sequence in terms of the sort of Greek myths of war. And the final part in that sequence, which is written in italics, is a sort of reworked quote from Heraclitus. And I read a lot of Heraclitus while I was writing this collection. It became a sort of guiding principle for me, Heraclitus and Pindar and sort of archaic Greek culture, because I was wondering about what they could say, what archaic Greek culture could say about the state of conflict and the state of humanity in conflict. So I drew him in, and his aphoristic, fragmented, poetic work into the Strongbox as a way of sort of commenting on what was happening right now.
The sort of, we'll come back to the Greek elements, because there's strong Greek elements all the way through, and one of the elements of it gives it this sort of terrible backdrop of always being like this. It takes, because you mix history with myth all the way through the poem, don't you? Like history and myth keep flickering, don't they, and intersecting and deforming each other almost. But one of the functions of the Greek elements, I thought, was this sense of this is how it's always been.
Well, also, this is how it's always been told. And that was also important to me, that we think about war, we're conditioned to think about war, and I think an achievement and glory and heroism in ways that were laid out for us, millennia ago, and we haven't really fully understood, I think, the extent to which we are conditioned by some of those beliefs, and how they're only one of a range of possible philosophical approaches to conflict, or just to humanity, really.
Yeah, indeed. So I want to just sort of jump on. Let's hear one more part on page 10, I think I've got here. It'd be good to hear more. Yes, let's have that section in page 10, and then we might have a cup of tea after that.
I think you'll need a cup of tea after this.
Perhaps even a biscuit, if we're lucky.
So I should say that the one of the other things about the Strongbox is there's an awful lot of Russian poetry in it. There's a lot of allusions to Russian poetry. I've just translated Russian poems, and this section begins with a little bit of Mandelstam from Tricia, his poem about Ovid leaving Rome, a poem I really, really love. Okay. So this is just a short excerpt from the same opening part. For men, the bronze. For women, wax. Although she never divined her fate, merely followed it like pulling on string, tore itself stickily away. The old women in the kitchen with their long shears, their bubbling pots, punish the young, and are punished in turn, slaps on the nape of the neck. They are pure, at least they talk a good deal about purity in this city where war is the father of all. They slip off shoes at the doors, and always, after wrestling or shooting, slaves run strigils over their naked backs, and before they are dressed in laundered gowns, they are rubbed with oils and unguents, forbidden to use deodorants or products or pain relief, or even gas at the dentist, strapping weapons on themselves, brandishing pikes, standing three to a chariot. They're like the heroes in children's tales, sleeping on dry bracken after a swim.
A few things I wanted to sort of ask you about in that section. One of the things is, another theme I think going through the book is this relationship between innocence and horror. The children, that lovely children's tale, sleeping on dry bracken after a swim, this picture of an idyll of innocence, and against the horrors of the naked backs and so on. I wonder whether you might say something about that. This, like at one point, there's a child sleeping on superhero sheets, very very tender, against still all this freighting of history and this dark charcoal, as it were.
Well, I think that the passage I just read, it relates to, in the book, it relates to the culture that she comes to, and in that culture that there is this worship of purity, and it seems to recur so often, and it seems such a positive thing, such a delightful thing in many ways, this innocence, this purity, this cleanliness, but often it has a really dark and sinister side to it. Purity in itself, you know, it doesn't have a kind of colouring to it, but it seems to be one of the qualities that can be converted into a sort of fascist, I suppose, quality.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. And I want to say, we'll have a tea in a second, but I'm struck by how you've got all these references, you know, to Pindar and Heraclitus and Russian poetry and other things, but you don't seem to be bringing them into it for intellectual reasons. I'm not reading you like, I don't know, Eliot, you know, where I don't expect masses of pages of notes, and I'm not reading you like, who was I thinking? Anyway, never mind. You know, sort of that they seem to be brought in for a different, they're not brought in as literary allusions, it seems to me, and that you're wanting the reader to say, oh, that's actually Heraclitus, I think, or that's actually Mandelstam or something. Could you say something about the atmosphere? Why are you bringing them in, and what they're doing? Because they're not being brought in for the usual reasons, are they? It seems to me.
I think probably they answered quite a personal psychological need to write with everything that I had at my disposal. So I've been translating Russian poetry for a long time, and so it's something that I had in me, and these are poems that I've had in me and part of my kind of life, and so. It's another part of the war, really, that when the war began, and I could see that, particularly at the beginning, the Russians were making massive inroads, and I thought they were going to occupy Ukraine fairly quickly. And there's this absolute sense of horror at a civilization that you've devoted so much of your life to, and it was shared by my Russian friends, and so what to do with all of that, because you're kind of carrying it around the whole time. So converting it into something, using it to write, felt like it was a psychological way of coping, I suppose, trying to turn it into something.
But also a way of deepening the atmosphere, and then estranging the atmosphere even. Somehow?
Yes, and I think also trying to write in a different sort of way in English, because those poems and those poets, they experienced completely different worlds. And so I suppose maybe subconsciously I was thinking that if you can use their resources, you can perhaps
find a way to describe what you're seeing that we perhaps don't have the resources for.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. So listen, we'll talk more about it in a moment, but let's go and have a cup of tea next door, and we'll come back in a minute. I'll ring a bell and we'll come back and carry on talking about it. Yeah.
It'll be really light after the
Lighter.
Okay, people, good to see you all back so promptly. Thanks for that. I like to start on time. Right, can we make a little ring with our chairs? Nice one, that's great. Now we're going to do an exercise now. We've had a read through, and I think we're all there with the text and so on. So what I'd like to do is this. Have you all heard of actioning? I thought so. Good. Standard stuff, but it can yield some insights, I find, especially at the beginning of the rehearsal process. And it can be invaluable with a tricky text, one that doesn't initially appear to have a narrative. So I'd like us to get into groups of 2 or 3. I think we have someone over if we go into groups of 2. No? Okay, you can be a threesome over there, so to speak. Now I'd like you each to take a fragment and action it line by line. This can be unfamiliar, so let's just do a group one together so we all have the hang of it. For example, in the speech, "It is true, I said." Yep? Have you found that one? It's page 14 in your script. Page 14? Lovely. Right, here we go. "It is true, I said, that morning in the basement we thought we had nothing left, but day after day we were losing one after another, brought home, defiled, dust-stained." What do we think are the actions that underpin that text there? If you want to think of it more loosely as, a gestus and a Brechtian sense, that can be useful. I think it may help if we stick to verbs as well. Which verbs are the machines behind this little piece? What is actually going on here? What's the author trying to make happen here? Yep, right, we've got, can you say that again? Anguish. Okay, anguish. Anguish is really more of an abstract state, right? Can we transform it into a verb, a doing word, a word of action? In fact, people, can we steer clear of abstraction here? Let's stick to verbs. I want the concrete. The truth is concrete, as Bert Brecht says. Yeah, no, hopelessness won't do either. I want active agency. Important to remember active agency in battle at all times. Otherwise, where's the conflict, the dynamic? If we can't identify it, what do we present as we speak the lines? If you like, where's the fight if you can't lift the sword? There are times when stasis doesn't cut the mustard. After all, I like to see the blossoming tree, but only my disgust at the war maker brings me to the rehearsal room.
That got you. So this is the second chapter. So it's wonderful. Let's say what do we do? I'm struck here immediately by the change of tone. Obviously, it's a sort of postmodernist. You suddenly become a postmodernist, and you're referring back to yourself, back to the text that we're rehearsing, even quoting apart from the previous chapter. So let's hear what you have to say about this chapter. I mean, it's a quite conscious change of mood, isn't it? And a lightening of mood. It reminded me of the porter scene in Macbeth. That famous scene where you've got so much darkness. Macbeth is probably thinking, we really can't just carry on with this. We need a bit of a laugh here and a bit of ribaldry, and then we'll go back. Was it that in your mind, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking how it does all get a bit hopeless, and I also wanted to. It does relate to a very sort of practical experience because I translated a lot for theatre, and quite often in the past, not so much now, and only some directors would talk about actioning and how to make a text active. That how does a text fit that? So it was a but there is also, I suppose, a point about words and deeds in that very, again, Greek sense.
But there's also a sort of, how did I write it? It's also points up another aspect of the whole poem, which is a rupture between cultures. You know, we've just gone through this really very startling long first chapter, this darkness that I was talking about. And then we've got this rehearsal room, this incredible rupture that we've got between cultures. And that's one of the things that we're all experiencing more and more, that, you know, we were talking about a friend of mine whose parents were in Ukraine when the war started, and I met up with him, and I then went off to have my croissant and flat white whilst his parents were being bombed. And this awful sort of rupturing of the world. And in a way, I wondered whether it was about that as well. You can say no.
I think it's true that we're sort of bombarded with different types of speech and different presentations of culture. But it's also how to interpret what we hear, I think.
And it's just good to have some comedy, isn't it? Good to have some comedy. It's just so, and you, in a way, performing it like that, suddenly, it's a whole comic set. It darkens at the end, doesn't it, again? But otherwise, it's a sort of comic set.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so, yes.
Was it a comic set? I thought it was funny. Anyway, that's enough of comedy. Let's go.
No, there are other funny bits.
There are other funny bits.
Yeah.
I'm obviously absolutely aware of them. But anyway, let's go to the next section that we chose, page 37. Where was I? So let's hear this section. This is quite a lot later on in the poem. We're moving through it a bit. And let's get you to read this, and Sasha, and then we'll talk about this again a bit more.
Yeah, this is a sort of the first of a dream sequence. There's lots of dreams in this book. But this dream is a dream that Helen has because she's a demigod. So she's sort of caught between gods and mortals, in effect. And yes, I'll just read it. There is one race of men, another of gods. As one whose lovely feet roam both camps, I once dreamt I was caught, uninvited, in the divine beachside home. I'd poured the gods olive oil, drunk from their cups, picked flowers they planted. Worse still, I had no memory. Had I asked permission? Had it been granted? I'll tidy here, I'll clear the rubble, I'll smarten the altar, take the first boat out and no one will know. I'll disappear over the water, I'll swim if needs be, I'll steal oars and row. But these thoughts, in the manner of nightmares, accompanied the approaching shrieks of gods wearing lurex, feathers and furs, with hooked claws and marble cheeks. Knowing I'd been caught in flagrante, I repented of such unforgivable sinning and offered my necklace of polished antler. Zeus plucked it from me, all the while grinning, and passed it to Hera. Her hair was ochre, and I had crossed her. I was ensnared. They drew me into their fierce circle to rip at me, cuff me, drag me upstairs. I knew what would come, and perhaps that was the dream, that their race will forever screw over the other, but destroys all those who stand in between.
So this is one of the places I want to talk about your introduction of rhyme. This is suddenly rhyme. I think there are earlier parts where rhyme's sort of there right from the beginning, sort of weaving through it. So I wonder whether you say again a bit more about rhyme perhaps in here, and this appearance of gods. I mean, part of it is that this, you seem to me to be writing a sort of fractured epic, an almost rubble epic. And in epic you have the gods, you also have a lot of innocence, you have sacrifice, you have warfare very often. You seem to me to be writing a modern, at times postmodern, sort of fractured epic, and that's the place for gods. And it's, I'm rambling on a bit, but I wonder what you would say about those elements of the poem.
Yeah, the gods play an increasingly larger role as it goes through, and in some ways that has to do with the fact that it's based on a sort of Greek myth or Greek story, but also partly to do with the fact that, you know, it's inconceivable a world without gods or without something beyond the horizon. And so kind of playing with that and considering it and turning it round was interesting to me, and increasingly occupied my feeling about the poem.
And it's another voice. This is Helen's voice. Is it?
Yeah, this is in effect. This is the I mean, it was originally when I reorganized everything, and this was the dream of the demigod Helen. So yes.
And does the rhyme come out of that, or how do you? Because as I say, there are all these erasures in it. There's all these disjunctions in it. There's this sort of fog of war all the way through it. I think it's almost got a particular kind of lighting to me. This book-length poem. It's sort of grey light of war, sort of bright and sort of dim at the same time, flickering or something. How does rhyme come out of that atmosphere?
Well, I think rhyme happens in conjunction. As I said, I think the form and the material are always very allied, and that particular section came out really in rhyme. It wanted to be in rhyme. It made itself in rhyme, and that's perhaps something to do with the fact that it's a slightly horrific dream. So there's an element of the sort of rolling momentum of rhyme, and perhaps also a slight irony that rhyme adds, which seemed to be part of the dream somehow. I did consider how you could write it differently. It was something that came to, and I thought, but it just insisted on itself, and there wasn't a great deal that I could do.
And interesting, because earlier on you were talking about rhyme having a trance-like effect.
Yeah.
So it's very right for dream, and it's very right for the gods somehow, who are seeing things in a whole, in a harmonious sense, even if it's broken from our perspective. So, but interesting, isn't it, how people often think that form is kind of stuck on, like I fancied writing a villanelle and off we go. Usually forms come out of content, and they're expressions of content.
Like the villanelle almost, to me it seems to come out of grief and loss, often, if not almost always. Well,
your villanelle is about your father, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Hang on.
No. No, it's not. No, it's not.
That's clear. Anyway, we'll come back to that. No, we won't. Can you erase that from the... Anyway. And then again, there's this section in italics, and again, is that...
Oh, that was her dream.
Her dream,
yes,
within it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting because none of this is sort of signposted. So the whole poem can read like a dream, can't it? It goes from voice to voice.
Yeah.
You hear the differences in the voices.
Yeah.
Like you heard that difference in the voice of the rehearsal rooms, completely different voice to this voice.
And that's something I did a bit in the Welfare Handbook part of Deformations, the part which refers to Gill, because it started to seem as if all the voices really flowed into each other, that it was a sort of collective experience. And to sort of insist on the individual started to seem kind of slightly almost inappropriate.
Right, yeah. I was wondering that because one of the reasons I reread that sequence, the Welfare Handbook, and it seemed to be almost grow into this whole book with that all these different voices. I can't find your voice, for instance, in the poem. Anyway, let's hear more of your voice, and let's have your actual voice, and let's go to the next section on page 39, the start of this chapter 6, called The Dirty Fire. So let's hear about that, and we'll talk a bit more about that as well.
Oh, this is also in rhyme. I wrote about this in a blog for Carcanet. this section here is related to a part of a poem by Pasternak called Waves, where he, well, I write about it at length in the blog, but I took that excerpt and kind of rewrote it and played with it. And you really don't need to know the Pasternak at all, but I certainly, when I was writing it, was thinking about his poem. He often writes about the poet's role and the poet's sort of status, and that always really intrigues me. So I kind of slightly, it's not a rewrite, it's not a version, I don't even know what to call it. It's almost like a dialogue with the original. You are not yet gone. They told me where you were and when you left. I could still catch you if I hurried, not stand around wasting my breath. I caught you up, but you died down. In your place, a brown patch. I knew I'd have to pour petrol over your tender features and strike a match. In the dirty fire of the great poets, there are lines of such naturalness that when you have torched the source, you too must end in wordlessness. At odds with everything in the fall of my life, I fell to my knees. I was a heretic, but no longer. I'm heartened by your simplicities. Let me exist underground with the iris, slowly opening my pale hands. My workings are unbearable. My renewal, what the world demands.
I mean, when I was reading, because I didn't know the Pasternak, I don't know the Pasternak at all, and my question was, what voice is this? How do you imagine a read? You know, because I don't know how many people know their Pasternak, but you know, how do you imagine the reader reading this, and what voice do you imagine? Is it Pasternak's voice? Is it the voice of the earth?
I mean, I don't think, and I haven't signposted it as Pasternak. I haven't put a footnote in, and I'm sort of only saying that because we're talking.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. You don't need to know it.
No, you don't at all. No, but there is a sort of dynamic in the poem which is hidden, and you know, it was just important to me that was there. I think if you have you know, if you talked about, I can't think of anything now because I'm. But if you alluded to a poem in the English language canon, then everybody would notice it and say, oh yes, that's an allusion to this. But it seemed to me that I could allude to work in translation that would be there with me, like a collective voice,
right,
and would be a way of. With being in the poem collectively that would kind of help in some way. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain.
But there's something interesting there for me about this collective voice, because it's almost like that's what you're struggling for in this poem, is to find a collective voice, and whether that's feasible now. Even can there be a collective voice?
I think I was very keen that it would be a sort of a bit like a sort of work that had many sides, like a theatrical work or something that had different facets within it. That was important to me, because it seems impossible to, some experiences, many experiences in fact, are impossible to capture with just an individual kind of, you feel like you need the full like lighthouse glass effect in order to convey what's happening. And
you can see why that needs a book-length poem. You know, you need that breadth, that whole lighthouse effect, like you say, so that you can go around these scenes and light them up, one after another from different perspectives. That's one of the things that struck me, is that it does need to be this long. I mean, it's not that long, is it, really, for a long poem, but it does need this length. Did you think about the length? Were you thinking of a length?
No, it was a very particular poem in that sense that I wrote it, and I knew when I got to the end, that's the end. Although, I absolutely knew that was the end. That was it. And it was a sort of trajectory. So it did have its own form. I then worked on it for about another year, really, just sort of sorting it out and rearranging parts of it and putting bits together and so on. But the actual original was came out as it was.
It does feel complete and very. Let's hear another part that's very much I really wanted to try and bring out some of the different voices when I was looking at it, and I wanted this wonderful, really a short, I thought a really classic lyric, this choral telephone. So let's
I
hear.
can't read that sitting down, actually, it's so short.
Okay.
Choral telephone, foaming listener, can you put me through to my sister? Resist this sea motion, it has you in its grip. She is begging you to board the last ship. From here on is death, you who faints at blood. Here is devastation. Turn back, my love. I have been led to a marsh by a hairless child, and my soul is moist. My glasses are salty. I am full of fluster. I send you a wave, my semblable, my sister.
Let's just hear that again, because it's a short little contracted lyric, and it'd be good to have. And again, it's got these different voices within it. And then let's see whether there's anything you want to say about it. I don't know why, it just really struck me as an example of this other voices coming in, and a very different form than we've just heard,
Choral telephone, foaming listener, can you put me through to my sister? Resist this sea motion, it has you in its grip. She is begging you to board the last ship. From here on is death, you who faints at blood. Here is devastation. Turn back, my love. I have been led to a marsh by a hairless child, and my soul is moist. My glasses are salty. I am full of fluster. I send you a wave, my semblable, my sister.
Is there anything you want to say about it? In a way, it's sort of.
No, I'm not sure. No,
I don't think there is really. But that's just the best thing is just to read it again. I just thought it was lovely, And again, you get the poem. You get this movement between narrative. There's play. There's sort of the thing set out as a play, like the rehearsal room. But that sort of form of play comes back. You get bullet points later on, and then you get these little tiny sort of lyric shapes that, speak for themselves completely. And again, at the end of this, you say August is a hopeless month, which goes back to my idea of this thing of it being a modern wasteland. And you were saying to me that you were slightly taking the mick of the wasteland here.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, let's have another part, and again another voice. Where did I put this? 50th. Yes, the beginning of this section called An Empty Stage, and this is for me another kind of lyric, but it's a different kind of lyric. Perhaps I wondered whether you might say a bit about what you mean by an empty stage. At one point, what do you say? You say, but a heavy curtain has fallen over this empty stage.
Yes. This is a section that has quite a few poems that are sort of reworkings. And in fact, that quote, an empty stage, comes from two poems at the end, which are Pushkin poems, which I reworked and sort of turned into something. They're quite heavily disguised. I'm not sure you'd recognise them. But those poems relate to... I could read those poems if you like.
Yeah.
Yes. So these poems relate to, again, Helen and Paris after Paris's death. But they're they're sort of almost two options of how you might feel about Paris being dead, as Helen, somebody who's sort of in a difficult political position in a sense.
Yeah.
So I'll read those two. I think they're both sonnets.
Yeah.
So the first one is it true, my friend, my head dancer, that at night, when dreamers are asleep,
and the moon alights on the huddling hills. The stopped-up tombs are emptied. I summon my shade. I am waiting. Come to me. Come once more. Appear to me just as you were when I last saw you, sickly pale as river mud, dragged, still bloodstained, to the pyre. Or come to me like faint starlight, the thinnest bird call, airy wraith, or even as a horrid vision. I don't much care. I call you back, not to speak to you of war, or to reproach us both. I don't want to know what the shades know, or even to tell you I repented publicly of you. I am missing you. I love you still. Know this, I am still yours. And the second one, there, under the stone walls of the city, bronze nibs tattooed him with his own graveside speech, and his little soul fled nimbly into the hills. But a heavy curtain has fallen over this empty stage. The report was brought by an indifferent witness, and indifferently I turned my face. How I once burnt and trembled at his name, leant at my window, weak with love, until he came, touched me with his calloused fingers. Where did it all go? Poor credulous shade. Those memories, I feel nothing for them. My debt is paid.
My debt is paid. And in this section somewhere you say narrative appalls me. And part of the meaning of this poem is a question about narrative. Isn't it? There's a worrying, a questioning about narrative itself, because the narrative, it seems to want to start off into a narrative and then breaks. And I'm struck that you have this word, narrative, appalls me. And for me, there's a sense here throughout the poem as a kind of elegy for the end of civilization. It sounds a bit grand, but there seems that to me in the poem. I don't know whether that's... Is that too sort of self-conscious, do you think, or what do you think?
I suppose it was a response to two things really. Firstly, just the idea of story and story arc, and in the harmonious nature of stories and myths and how they all tie up. But I think there was also a sense that all the narratives that you're hearing on the news are actually genuinely appalling, and that you know where they're going. Yeah.
So narrative appalls me. Let's hear that beginning part of that empty stage as well, this whole section in italics there at the start, because again, for me, it's like you're looking for a universal voice, and in italics again.
Yes. So this is the opening section, and I'll read it and then.
Death came to the plain and perched in a tree. She wore a riding habit with puffed sleeves. Her shoulder blades were a pattern of coal-ringed eyes, tweed skirts falling in stiff folds behind her. When she turned her head, it was stumpy, foreshortened. Wherever she directed her gaze, there was absence. Doors softly closed. Doves tucked into their cots. Deer froze. The day held its breath. The sun stopped to watch.
Well, I was thinking about, I got to that point in the book, and actually, very helpfully, a sparrowhawk landed in our garden.
That's good. And the day held its breath, and the sun stopped to watch.
And the birds vanished.
Yeah. Again, that's what I'm getting from that. You see, this sense of civilization ending. The sun would stop to watch.
Yeah.
But after all the sound and fury, to go back to Macbeth, the whole thing just falls apart, and the sun stops to watch, and the day holds its breath. Right, so let's move on. I told you that the funnies would go. I wanted to look at this other this parabolic aspect. There's a sudden parable about an egg, and I thought we might hear that, and then one or two more, and then we'll get you to sign lots of copies.
Yeah.
But let's hear this parable on 68, I think.
Yes, 67.
Oh right. Oh yes, that's 67.
I should read just from above because there's a little bit about this that explains it.
Well, you wrote the poem, so I think it is.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the poem "The Fly" by Holler. Yeah, is it?
Oh yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Yeah. So it sort of refers to that, and it's a little bit in italics, so it's a sort of Heraclitus bit. For gods, all things are fair and just, even a fly on the eye of the royal armourer, whereas mortals are split between care and lust, following the path of the directionless cockchafer. There was once an egg, the biggest egg in the world, and it grew and grew until it was so big it couldn't be moved from the eye where it lay. The largest eye in the world, set deep in the deepest socket, deeper than the hull of the Titanic, deeper than the sea itself, like this deep, says the god, space deep, dancing and spreading his arms as wide as wings, very, very deep, opening his own eyes so wide they float above his head. But imagine now, all that depth concertinaed up, 1,000,000 little folds, 1,000,000 billion creases, folded and folded and folded until it's teeny weeny teeny, stuffed into a little capsule. A what? A locket, yes. And the locket put in a jewellery box, and the jewellery box into a hidden drawer, yes, a secret one only a king would know about. And the secret drawer inside another drawer, and that drawer in a campaign chest, and that campaign chest in a tent, and the tent stands on a plain, a wide plain. This plain is covered in tiny tents, so very many of them, but this one is of elaborate gold-painted canvas. In it, a hero walks up and down. Yes, he walks up and down in anguish and rage. But he's not the subject of this story. No, not him.
That's great. That's really great. And he thought, it's a parable, isn't it? And it's one of those moments in poetry where you get a parable, and it definitely means something, but you don't know what. But sometimes that's the most powerful parabolic or metaphoric sense, is where you know this means something, but you can't ascribe it to a linear, sequential thought. At least that's what struck me. But again, it's a wholly other voice. A sudden child parable voice, fairy tale voice. Fairy tale has been woven through it, as well as myth, as well as broken narratives, as well as lyric. But this is a sort of child parable. Is there?
Well, it relates approximately to these sections about the gods, and it's when the gods in they can often seem like animals or children in the way they behave, because they're in the Homeric myths anyway, their feelings and their desires are so on the surface, they're so sophisticated in a way. It's just jealousy, rage, there's nothing particularly kind of adult about the gods. They just do what they want. These are the children gods organising things.
Okay, let's hear it. I haven't got anything else to say about it. I just sort of wanted everyone to hear that. Let's go to this. We've got two more sections I want to go into. The fourth dream, just on the next page, actually. And perhaps another theme that we haven't yet touched on is this Greek theme. I was saying to you that I thought you bring in the sort of Greek myth, which used to be a bit of a commonplace. It's sort of gone out of fashion rather now. But you sort of seem to me to have brought it in to chill the atmosphere of the poem. There's something about those Greek myths that are so sort of impersonal. The particular atmosphere, isn't there, to Greek myth, that we've never heard that sound again. It's sort of like nature itself speaking, like the collective voice that the collection's trying to get to. Perhaps say something about these repeating dreams. They start slightly comic at times again, and there's comic elements in the dreams generally. Say something about these Helen's dreams. That she has 4 dreams at least.
Yeah.
4 title dreams.
Yeah, there are lots of dreams in the collection generally, and they are funny. I think. I mean, I think that dreams are potentially extremely funny because the way they reorganise the facts of your conscious life into nonsense, but very entertaining nonsense quite often, even when it's quite harrowing. Yeah. And so I wanted the dreams, sort of the subconscious life of and they start out with Paris, Helen in Paris, and she wakes up and she tells him her dreams, and he's not wildly interested, and then he's gone, and she's just on her own telling her dreams, and I think this is the final dream. And again, they're sort of they're a little bit like the theatre director in that their dialogue. There's quite a few sections of the book that's supposed to be dialogue, theatrical dialogue, and the dreams are part of that. And so this is really a sort of monologue. And this is the last one. 4th dream. Helen is lying on a straw pallet. I took everyone to the station, saw them onto their trains. In other dreams, I have taken trains myself on long journeys, on railway lines that passed beyond borders into trackless lands, through tundra, wild places. All these dreams of travel were present in this dream. They were dream memories inside it. I could have opened them up like celestial tablecloths and spread them out as their own dreams, but I didn't. This time, I was sending off others instead. When the trains had rolled out and away, I returned alone to the walled yard. And when the man with the scarifying knife said it was my turn, I lay down on the ground. It didn't hurt, but it was shameful, and an old woman said it should never have happened. I should tell someone, but who can I tell? My wounds are not painful, but small nodes like buds have begun to appear in them. Which tell you you're looking at me.
I mean, that's pretty scary. I mean, the
Yeah, I'm really sorry. This is not. You should just take this back to the desk, Helen.
They become nightmares, don't they?
Yes,
they're nightmares as much as anything. Foreboding nightmares about an unspecified war, an unspecified future.
Well, I was interested by the way that how dreams, different ways people have thought about dreams, and in many cultures they're seen as auspicious or prophesying something that's going to come. So in the initial dreams, there is that between Helen and Paris. She starts talking and he's not interested, and then she says something about the war, and he goes, "Oh, hang on, this could be really important information. This is like having a spy in bed with me who's going to tell me what the other side are thinking." So that then the subconscious and reality become interwoven in a way I think is very common in many cultures.
Very much so. So listen, we've only got a bit of time. Just go. I wanted to sort of finish with these last. Again, another striking formal move you've made here at the end. Move is a bit trivial way of putting it, but you have these 8 declarative sentences, all end stopped. We could have talked about punctuation as you sometimes punctuate, sometimes don't. But you've got these last end stopped 8 lines, which feel like a summation except for I'm not quite sure what they're summing up, but they feel like it. They feel like somehow the whole poem is in these last 8 end-stop lines. They're all like one-line stanzas, which I think is the first time that's appeared in this form. You know, you've got bullet points earlier on, you've got the dialogues in the play scripts, you've got these little tiny lyric things going on throughout, you've got these fractured voices, and then you've got these 8 declarative statements. Is there anything you can say about these 8 statements?
Hard to know what to say. They are all recent images, I suppose. So,
right, but they do sort of sum the poem up.
Yeah, they felt like the end point of the poem when I got to them.
Yeah.
I'll read them. Yes, yeah.
But from my booth in 8 frames, I saw the whole proceedings. I saw a fleet of boats heave up against the sky. I saw us emerging from the flaming trees. I saw our animal heads melt in fiery birth. I saw a priest come forward to bless a tank. I saw a direct hit on a philosopher's hearth. I saw the lonely tiger's massive eye. I saw a shoebill crouching in a sink. I saw a dystrophic man lift up a lyre.
Perhaps that's a great place to finish. Thank you very much.